Okay, the third kind of fiber within the cytoskeleton, these are the intermediate filaments. And if you recall, these are going to be the ones that are not your thinnest, not your widest in diameter, but they're somewhere in between. They're also made out of a protein that's called keratin. And the keratin, again, makes these long fibers, and you can take multiple keratin fibers, twist them together to make the actual intermediate filament. Depending on how many of those keratin fibers that you sort of twist together, that'll make the diameter a little bit different for each of the different kinds of intermediate filaments that you can find within the cytoskeleton of a cell. Now, the intermediate filaments are quite a bit different from the first two kinds of fibers that we talked about, the microtubules and the microfilaments. They're different in that they are much more static within the cell. So let's go back to the microtubules and the microfilaments just for a second, right? Those are dynamic elements of the cytoskeleton. So that means that if a cell needs to deconstruct them from one area of the cell, it can do that, and then it can rebuild them in some other place. It would be kind of like, you perhaps deconstructing your right hand and then reconstructing it on your left hand side so you have two left hands instead, right? Our skeleton doesn't do that, and yet the microtubules and the microfilaments within the cell can actually do that for the cell. The intermediate filaments, though, these guys are more like your skeleton. Once it's in place, it tends to stay there. And this is sort of reflected in the function of these intermediate filaments as well. So these guys are usually used to support cell shape and to actually fix organelles like the nucleus here, sort of in place so it doesn't bounce around on the inside of the cell. All right, so that's it for the cytoskeleton of the cell, these fibers that help to support the inside of the cell, give structure, move things around, keep things in place. But these aren't the only fibers, let's say, that are important for cell function. The cells themselves, whether they're animal cells or plant cells, also tend to produce material that they dump to the outside of the cell to make sort of a surrounding matrix that also helps the cells to function either on their own or in conjunction with other cells as part of a tissue, right? And so most cells, doesn't matter if they're plant or animal, they're going to synthesize and secrete these materials, either polysaccharides like cellulose to build a cell wall for the plant cell, or maybe other polysaccharides in conjunction with proteins for an animal cell to build something that's called an extracellular matrix. So regardless of what kind of cell we're talking about, most cells are going to secrete these extra materials, dump them to the outside of the cell, and those materials will hang out there and they will perform a variety of different functions for the cells that initially produce them, right? So let's take a look at some examples of these extracellular materials that get put down that help a cell organize its activities. So first of all, let's talk about the cell wall of plants, right? So the cell wall is something we've talked about previously. It's something that plant cells have that animal cells don't, right? And it's this extracellular structure that will essentially protect the plant cell. It helps to maintain its shape, and it prevents any excessive uptake of water. Now, plant cells are not exclusive in that they have a cell wall. In fact, it's actually the animal cells that are kind of strange in that they don't have a cell wall, because there are plenty of other types of cells that actually do have cell walls. This includes prokaryotes, so bacteria, archaeal cells, fungi also, eukaryotes, have cell walls, and there are some unicellular eukaryotes, the protists, that also have their own type of cell wall. All the cell walls are different. They're put together using different materials, but they generally have the same purpose, right? This protection of the cell, giving its shape. Now, going back to the plant cell walls, though, right? These guys are mainly made out of the cellulose fibers, but they do have other materials embedded in them, so typically polysaccharides and proteins as well. Now, if we take a look at the plant cell wall, so let's imagine, let's say a seedling, right? And seedlings are made out of these, really new cells. And so let's draw, let's say, two cells. So here's the plasma membrane of one cell. Here's a little nucleus. Here's the plasma membrane of the second cell. We'll give this guy a nucleus too. So as these cells are created, they will set down what is called a primary cell wall. Right? So they're going to produce cellulose. They're going to dump it to the outside of the cell. And it's going to look something like this in red. All right? So that's your primary cell wall. Now, as the cells mature, they may actually lay down a secondary cell wall. Usually this is a lot more rigid. And so if the secondary cell wall is actually laid down after the primary cell wall, remember, the cell wall is something that the cell makes on the inside and then dumps all that material to the outside. So the secondary cell wall is actually laid down in between the plasma membrane and the primary cell wall. And that gives extra support to the cell, right? So in yellow, we're going to have our secondary cell wall. And so this makes these plant cells kind of like little bricks, right? And they stack them all together to make the plant tissue. Now, the thing is, though, is if you're making a brick wall, right, you can't just stack bricks together. They're going to topple. What you need is some sort of glue, some sort of mortar, right, to hold the cells together. And so plant cells will also produce a material that's called pectin. And this pectin is really sticky, and it actually sits right in between those plant cells, forming what is called the middle lamella. So you can think of it kind of like the mortar, the sticky substance that's holding those little plant cells together, right, to form the tissue. So we've got our middle lamella, we've got our primary cell wall, we've got our secondary cell wall. Now, one more thing that is shown down here in this image, right? So you have your sort of darker orange plasma membrane and the cell wall on the outside of these plant cells. You'll notice that there's little connectors here, right, between the cells that cross across that cell wall that's essentially separating the plant cells. These are those plasmodesmata that we talked about a little bit earlier in the chapter. This is a way for cells, these plant cells, to communicate with each other across those really rigid cell walls. So we'll take a look at that in a couple of slides. All right, let's switch gears for a little bit and talk about animal cells, right? So animal cells, they don't have a cell wall. Instead, they produce a much sort of fluffier, lighter, more open matrix of different molecules on the outside of the cell. And this is called the extracellular matrix, or the ECM. So this particular image is a cross-section through sort of the edge of a cell. So here's the plasma membrane, right, our phospholipid bilayer with a variety of proteins embedded in it. Here you can see the inside of the cell, so the cytoplasm, and the microfilaments that are part of the cytoskeleton arranged on the inside there of the plasma membrane. On the outside now, this is where that extracellular matrix exists. Now, the extracellular matrix is a combination of a variety of different proteins and carbohydrate components, right? So you have these long collagen fibers that helps to support the tissue. The collagen fibers are actually held on to the surface of the plasma membrane by these little guys, these fibronectin proteins that are actually attached to some of the proteins that are embedded within the membrane. And then sort of wound all the way around here is an aggregate of both protein and sugar. So this is a proteoglycan complex. Mainly sugar, the glycan is at the end, but it has a proteo or protein component to it. And so all this material forms this sort of matrix on the outside of animal cells. This extracellular matrix has a couple of different roles that it plays for the cells. So it can regulate cellular movement. It can actually regulate expression of a variety of different genes. It can regulate cellular function. So a variety of different roles here. It also helps to sort of hold the tissue together, right? You have many different individual cells. They are all performing the same function. You need them to stick together. The extracellular matrix allows them to sort of stick together. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about in chapter 6 are what are called cell junctions. So this is where neighboring cells in the tissue and organs or organ systems have to, number one, stick together and oftentimes interact and communicate through direct physical contact. We've already introduced one example of a cell junction, and that was the plasmodesmata in plants. Right, so this is the only type of cell junction that we're going to cover in this particular course. But if we go back just for a second to the cells that I drew earlier, the plant cells, looking at the cell wall, right? And so we have these really, rigid, thick cell walls plus the plasma membrane in the middle lamella. How are these two cells going to communicate? Well, the nice thing is that they actually have the ability to, let's see, we can get that back for a second, right? Make these channels in between the two cells. And in these channels, you're going to have the plasma membrane between the two cells actually continuous. So let me see if I can erase this little part right here. All right, so if I erase this little part right here, go back to my pen, and I'm going to draw the plasma membrane sort of continuous from one plant cell to the next. And now you'll see that there's this nice little communication channel where these two cells can very easily exchange, small molecules. Ions can go in any which direction. Maybe some signaling molecules can travel from one cell to the next. An easy way for these plant cells to communicate with each other. And so those channels are going to be called your plasmodesmata. So down here, this is an electron micrograph looking right at the intersection of between two of these cells. So here's one plant cell, here's the second plant cell. You can see a white cell wall for this guy, a white cell wall here for this guy, the middle lamella kind of in this gray in between. And here are all the plasmodesmata, all of those communication channels in between those two cell walls. All right, what about animal cells? Animal cells are a little bit different. They actually have three different kinds of cell junctions. The first type we're going to talk about are called tight junctions. So let's take a look at this animation.
Tight junctions, which bind cells together, are found predominantly in epithelial tissues, such as the lining of the intestines. Tight junctions form a barrier that prevents fluids from moving between the intestinal space and the space between cells.
All right, so these guys, really important in your small intestines, where you don't want any of your digested food just non-specifically squeaking through in between those cells, right? You want to create this impermeable barrier so that the intestinal cells here can select what nutrients they want to absorb across their plasma membranes that will feed your body. Right? And so these tight junctions are places where the membranes of adjacent cells are squeezed really tight together so that they prevent any material squeaking in between the two. All right, let's take a look at the second type of cell junction in animals. These are called desmosomes.
Desmosomes, or anchoring junctions, appear as thickened patches in the cell membrane region between two cells. Desmosomes contain specialized proteins such as keratin, the same protein found in fingernails and hair, that increase the rigidity of tissues. Desmosomes, such as those found in epithelium, smooth muscle, and many other animal tissues, are button-like junctions that bind cells together and also function as anchors for fibers in the cytoskeleton.
Okay, so in, again, epithelial tissue like your skin, right? You can take your skin and you can tug on it, and you're not going to rip off a chunk of your skin cells, right? They are stuck together really, really tightly. And one of the reasons is that the cells are connected using these desmosomes, right? So a series of proteins here that help to anchor those cells one to the next. The nice thing also is that these desmosomes are places where you have parts of the cytoskeleton attached, right? So it's almost as if the cytoskeleton of this cell moves through and across the cytoskeleton of that cell, giving a lot of structural integrity to the tissue itself. All right, the last kind of cell junction in animals is the gap junction.
In gap junctions, or communicating junctions, two cells are separated by a small gap, which is bridged by specialized channels that allow the passage of water and small molecules. Gap junctions help coordinate the activities of adjacent cells. For example, a hormone that stimulates one cell will often activate adjacent cells as well by the passage of intracellular signals through gap junctions.
So gap junctions are essentially the equivalent of plasmodesmata in plants, just gap junctions happen to be in animals instead.